I'm Patty Franz. I am a member of Christ in Richmond, and I'm really happy to see so many people here. This is unscripted, but I'm going to say that if I had heard our presenter, Jessica, before I wrote my talk might be a little different, but we'll carry on. I've been weaving since about 1977. At that time, I took a class at the Newark, Delaware Recreation Center where we lived at the time, and I had been interested in weaving since childhood, but that was the first time I had a loom, and I presently have 3 looms. So obviously, I have not stopped weaving. I was also a spinner for a while. One of my favorite parts of being a spinner was participating in 3 sheep to shawl contests. And that was where 3 spinners, I was a spinner, and 1 weaver would get together to weave a shawl in a limited amount of time. It's a competition. So we won all of the 3 that I was in, and that was fun. So today I'm going to talk about how we get clothing. What we know about Dorcas is that she provided robes and other clothes for the poor. What we don't know about her is the parts of the process she did to make the clothing for the needy. So I'm going to take you through the process of creating cloth from string to clothes. I'm going to refer to spinners and weavers as female throughout my presentation. I believe women are the creators of are the inventors of all things clothing. Judith K. Brown, an anthropologist, published a 5-page paper in 1970 titled Note on the Division of Labor by Sex. Brown found that the issue of whether or not a community relies on women as the chief providers of a given type of labor depends on the compatibility of this pursuit with the demands of childcare. So the jobs regularly assigned to women must be carefully chosen to be compatible with simultaneously childlike. I'm very grateful to Elizabeth Barber and her book, Women's Work, not only for that information, but for a lot of information I have about early weaving and spinning. We start at the basic level of all cloth, string. In the beginning, string was made of plant fiber. Some smart woman found out that there were long, tough fibers inside some plants. Once she got the fiber out of the plant, she twisted them with her fingers. And after she twisted the fibers from one plant, she had to figure out a way to add more fibers from a similar plant so that her string would get to be longer. We don't know exactly when humans actually started creating string, since fibers do not last as long as pottery and stone. The best document estimate we have at this point in time of when humans started to make clothing out of something other than animal hides is about 40,000 years ago. There have been fibers found in the Republic of Georgia and in the caves of France. In Georgia, the evidence is small microscopic fibers, and the dating on those is 40,000 years. Those microscopic fibers were clearly dyed different colors. In the French caves, evidence of string was accidentally discovered when someone broke open a clod of dirt and there was a line within the clod of where the cord had been. That discovery is dated about 25,000 years ago. Both sets of strings were made from plant, not animal. Whenever string started being used, humans were likely nomadic and kept all their possessions with them. Think about what a difference string made. You could tie up bundles. You could sew animal skins together to be warmer. Once you had string, you could fish, set nets for catching birds. String really is an amazing invention. As I said, the first string was from plants. This first cord most likely came from a tall plant that resembled flax. Tall meant the fibers were long, and the longer they were, the more easily the string could be made. Today, string and yarn are made of many substances. We have cotton, linen, silk, polyester, rayon, and wool. In the Roman Empire at the time of Dorcas, the main fibers were in use were wool and linen. Cotton was being spun and woven during this time, but not in that area of the world. For many of those who lived in that part of the world, I would say there would be mostly wool string during this period. The land occupied by the Jewish people would have been good grazing land, a place where raising sheep and goats happened then and still happens today. Wool yarn was an easier and cheaper product to create than linen in this environment. You can pluck wool off your sheep and you get both wool and meat and maybe even some milk from the same animal. You can even spin wool yarn without washing the fleece. Spinning in the grease means that the lanolin stays in the wool and helps make it waterproof. However, Dorcas was a resident of Joppa, which is on the coast. Joppa is a major port, so there were many items available through trade. Dorcas might have had access to linen or wool. If Dorcas could get linen, it would take more processing, and it might make the price of the yarn or fabric higher. I told you that linen was probably one of the first fibers. Linen became more prevalent as humans settled into communities. Once humans started gathering in one place, they were growing crops, and flax was one of them. With this stability, the processing of the plant fiber could be more controlled. And this is what people do to get linen yarn. Start with the planting of the flax. Then you pull the plant up by the roots so the fiber stays as long as possible. And then you dry it so the outer shell gets dry, but then you soak it so you can break the outer shell off. And after soaking, which is called retting, and the breaking is done, the outer pieces could be combed off. And then the last thing here is the fiber would be hackled so that the short pieces of fiber were separated from the long fibers. And then finally, the person doing all this could spin. I actually know a weaver here that lives very close to me who still goes through all this, a whole process. She plants the flax and works her way through and spins it, and then makes her own clothing. At this time, Egypt produced a lot of linen, yarn, and clothing. But as I said, Israel had a better agricultural climate for sheep and goats. Since we don't really know anything about what fabric Dorcas had available to her, I'm leaning towards wool. Anyone want to take a bet for linen? What would you choose if you were Dorcas?
Linen might be cooler in the desert.
Anyone else?
Probably wool. I actually do a little bit of spinning myself, so.
Have you spun linen or just wool?
Wool and cotton. I haven't gotten a chance to do linen yet.
Anyone else want to vote?
I would say wool.
Okay. I have a friend who spins and weaves, and she told me about mixing fibers to make them cooler or less heavy. But if they didn't have the opportunity to do that, I don't know how you conquer the heaviness of wool in a hot climate.
So interesting that you bring up the mixed fiber, because remember in Deuteronomy 22:11, it is wool and linen fiber put together are actually prohibited. Deuteronomy 22:11 says, do not wear clothes of wool and linen together. So I don't know. It's obviously was possible because it was prohibited, but we don't know. So, and we'll never know what Dorcas had. If you're going to weave cloth, you need a lot of string or yarn. Remember, I said my sheep to shawl team had 3 spinners and 1 weaver. Speed was important there, but still the 3 spinners could barely keep up with one weaver, which means the women who discovered this twisting the fiber had to come up with a more efficient way to spin yarn than just what they were doing. So the spinning wheel is the first thing we think of when we think about spinning yarn. And I assume some of the people who've been talking about spinning might use a wheel. You've probably all seen one like one of these. But unfortunately for Dorcas and other women of that period, spinning wheels were not yet invented. They were first used in India about 500 CE. The first improvement for spinning was probably the distaff. This is a stick that had fibers wound around it at the one end like the cotton candy. If you're looking at this picture, you can see the woman holding her distaff up in the air, which is probably not how it worked. She probably tucked it under her arm because you really need two hands for spinning. In true serendipity, while I was working on this, I found this stained glass window,
Wow.
which is Mary holding a distaff. She doesn't have a spindle or any way to do anything with it, but there she is. After figuring out to have a ready supply of fiber on the distaff, the next invention was likely the drop spindle. Creating thread on your lap implies you're sitting still. It is also difficult to get a very long piece of string or thread if you have to keep using your hands. And since most humans were nomadic, when thread came to be, it would be great if you could multitask. If you would want something that you could do while moving. So here is an early drop spindle. As you can see, they were likely a stick, a rock, and a hook. Dorcas or women of that era might have used one like this, or the weights might have looked like this. To use a spindle, you attach the fiber to an existing string, and then you turn and drop the spindle, making sure it's spinning, and the thread draws out from the fibers you have on your distaff or in your hand. So this woman is doing the drawing out between her right hand has some fiber and her left hand is holding the spindle. I never got this. I don't know about the people who've talked about spinning can do this or not, but I've never figured out how to make this work. But
Actually the only way that I have to spin right now. I don't have a spinning wheel.
you don't have a spinning wheel? Well, good for you, because I couldn't keep it rotating and draw out the thread, and it just was hard.
The way that I do it is I actually spin it first, have it drop and then spin, and then I'll actually hold that and then pull out, and it actually loosens it up, loosens the spin, but it also spins it in the process as well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You can put a lot of spin in a short piece and then stretch the spin into a longer piece, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have friends who come to my weaving guild who spin the whole time, and most of them use drop spindles. So now we know how to spin or how to make string or yarn. But how do we weave this into clothing? I'm going to show you some pictures of what looms look like today. This is an older one from a museum. This is one of my looms. This is a loom from South America called a backstrap loom. This is a rigid heddle loom, which is actually a fairly recent invention as far as weaving goes. And then this is a small frame loom. This is the closest of these pictures to what the women of Dorcas's time and place would be using. But they would be using one that looked like this. This is a hanging loom. And you need to take your warp, your yarn, and hang it from either a stick or the ceiling, some kind of frame. And then you put either rocks or clay weights at the end of the threads. In some archaeological sites, rows of weights were found that indicate where the looms had been. Of course, any thread, weaving, or even the wood had long since rotted, but the weights gave the archaeologists the clue. The same thing is true of the weights I showed you earlier from the spindles. The sticks were no longer present, but the rock weights were often found in women's graves. Weaving on these looms could be narrow, like the backstrap loom I showed you, or it could be wide. I love this pottery showing two women weaving on the same loom. It meant the cloth could be that much wider. To weave on any loom, the weaver needs to create a way to interlock the threads. The threads that hang down on a weighted loom are referred to as the warp, and they are the multicolored ones in this picture. The weft, which are the threads that go back and forth, are then threaded over and under the warp. The weights at the bottom help hold tension so that the cloth holds together. So you could just go in and out, in and out, in and out with a shuttle or something, but that would take you way too long. So as you can see, there are two sticks here being used in this hanging loom. Let's call the stick on the bottom the shed stick, and it might be holding separately the odd numbered threads on the warp. The top stick would be called the heddle stick, and I don't know if you can see the threads. The white thread goes over the stick, under a thread, over the stick, under a thread, till you've got it all knotted there to the stick. So if you want to pull the even threads, which is what would be connected to the heddle stick, up so you can weave between, you pull on that stick and the string, the white string, pulls it forward. This is another example of, this is a horizontal loom, but you can see on your right, you have one set of threads lifted, and on your left, there's a different set and they cross in the middle. This is when I wish we were all in the same room so we could try this together. It's easier to do than to explain. So we're back at the hanging loom that I was showing you before. This is the top of the loom, and this is how the fabric is woven. You start at the very top and you work your way down. And you can see this thread that the yellow crosses over, under, over, under. This is called plain weave and is probably the most likely weave that would be used with a weighted loom. It's just the easiest fashion of weaving. Most modern looms work the opposite direction. You start at the bottom or at the front of the loom and work your way back. So now we have thread and we have a way to make cloth. The last thing to mention is what the clothing might have looked like that Dorcas made for the widows. And it never occurred to me, Jessica, about what Jessica said about that they might be wearing shrouds. I think that is a very, very cool idea. But we are not talking high, fast, slow, or any kind of fashion. We're talking utilitarian, basic boxy shapes like this, or like what these men are wearing here. And I'm guessing not overly decorated because that would cost money. And what we're talking about, I think, when we're talking about clothing the poor is utilitarian, not beauty. I also think that sewing would be minimal, which is a good thing since it would be all done by hand, with a needle that would look much like ours today. According to the Encyclopedia of the Bible, the basic design of needles has not changed at all in the millennia they've been used. Needles made from sharp pierced bones have been found dating as far back as the 6th millennium BCE. In the days of Israel's history, needles were commonly made of bronze, either pierced or with a loop. If you can see, I don't know if you can see the loop all the way on the side there to form the eye, but they have been found by archaeologists made of ivory, bone, bronze, iron, and are often from 1.5 to 5 inches in length. I have read that in Japan, the clothing was all made of squares and rectangles so that pieces could be taken apart and used from one garment to the next as parts wore out. This would also make it easier to weave. And so I'm wondering if that was pretty much the same way, that the body of the tunic could be woven in one piece of cloth woven lengthwise, and then a belt or a mantle could be made of older cloth as it got worn out. There's one special tunic I will mention. According to John 9:23, when the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. They also took his tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. Anyone want to make a guess as to how this would be woven?
It had been woven by thread that was kind of left on the loom and that was sewn into it.
It's one option. Anybody have any other ideas?
Not knowing anything about looms, but the wider part where the shoulders were, could that have been done on one loom and then transferred to another one when you get to the narrower parts?
Well, that's an interesting idea. I hadn't thought of that.
What about if you had like a spiral?
Like you wove round and round instead of
Yeah.
back and forth. That's exactly how I think it would have been done. If we use this weighted loom as an example, instead of going back and forth, you would put twice as many warp threads on as you needed for one layer, and then you would go around and around. But instead of having 2 sticks, you'd have 4, because you'd have 2 layers that were joined on the sides, and you'd have to be very, very careful that you didn't cross, because if you cross, then you wouldn't have you would no longer have a space in between. So that kind of seamless tunic would take an incredible weaver, and I assume John mentioned it because it was so unusual.
I always think of it as a real gift of love that
Yes,
someone wove or had woven, to honor and to show their love to Jesus.
yeah, I think you're absolutely correct. I think that it was an amazing gift to give someone, anyone, not just Jesus, but anyone. And I think you're right that it shows that someone loved him very much. So what parts of this process do you think Dorcas did? When we talk about having made tunics or shrouds, did she start with the string? What do you think?
Well, the widows were showing the garment that she made, so I thought that would have done the construction of them, whatever the weaving or whatever made them the garment that you would actually wear, not the earlier process.
So maybe just buying the fabric and sewing it.
If that's what you said, they didn't do much sewing, but so if she
Well,
would-
you have to put it, you probably have to sew up the side seams. If
well,
that
maybe
makes sense.
maybe she did weaving and sewing, but it would.
Yeah.
I think they're showing what she actually gave them. You know, that she did that part of it, not that she did the earlier part and then passed it on to somebody else to finish.
Anybody else?
Well, I have read that in the New Testament times that they were able to buy fabric pretty easily. So my guess would be like yours, that she was probably doing the sewing, but that's just my guess.
Anyone else?
I'm going with the whole process. So,
Maybe,
I'm in the process of making a funeral pall for my church. And I will tell you, I'm really, really glad I didn't have to spin.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fabric.
I think that she might have done the weaving and sewing, but I'm not entirely sure about the spinning, especially if she lived in like a city area. Because there wouldn't be too many sheeps out there in the city.
Yeah.
Perhaps she was running a business and had other people who did the spinning and the weaving and producing the fabric, and then she made the clothing out of it.
Amen. Yeah.
I mean, we don't know. We know that Lydia that we talked about yesterday probably was very wealthy, given what business she was in. But we know less about Dorcas. We just have fewer facts. So I know I went through this pretty quickly. I always write on my speeches, go slow, and then I don't go slow. So any questions anybody has? We have a little
I
time.
think
You know,
did
we
it.
don't really know if this was a business for her.
Right.
You know, it's almost as though these were gifts that she gave to people. She did it, as Jessica was talking about her grandmother, you know, giving away all her quilts.
Mhm,
I had a
mhm.
my mother made things all the time, knitted and crocheted and cross stitched and all kinds of things. And you know, she did it all to give away. Almost almost everything she made, she gave away to somebody. And maybe that was what Dorcas did. Maybe it was not a business.
There's no reason she couldn't have been both. She could have had a business, but also gave that same expertise she had for her business in her charitable works too. People do that. People often will volunteer with gifts they have that they use in their jobs, but they'll also use them at the church
Mhm.
or some other organization.
Yeah.
It could have been like a kind of tithing for her.
Mhm.
Yes. Yeah.
I loved
Untapped treasure.
I loved what Jessica said about wrapping the quilt around her. And I can imagine that these widows, her friends, felt the same way about Dorcas, that she cared for them and loved them. And they would have felt a part of her in that those outfits, tunics, shrouds.
Yeah.
That's really beautiful.
Mhm.
I'd like to interject something for a moment. It's sort of a little off topic, but this is because of the way the Bible's written. But I find it's interesting that two men go to get Peter,
Yes.
not any of the women. Just they got to send the men, otherwise Peter won't come.
I was waiting for Jessica to say something about that, but I didn't know if she would. But
I noticed it and I didn't want to
Open
Oh,
that
much
can of worms.
attention.
huh?
But given travel, etc.
But then just wait till tomorrow.
Yeah, I don't
What-
know if women traveled as much as men in those days.
The
Go
women
ahead,
were,
Sylvia.
Wait
the
till we
women
go.
were
Well,
staying
I,
at the,
I want to ask everybody to remember exactly what you went through to get this cloth and stuff, because tomorrow when we talk about Phoebe, we're going to talk about some of the preconceptions we have about what her life was like,
Mm.
and perhaps dispel some of those. But it's just your weaving just feeds right into why women were so valuable at that time.
I was going to say too, travel involved robbers, and
Uh-huh, right.
it wasn't like our travel. We just get in the car and go. Think
Mhm.
about robbers as I'm going down the road, but
Right.
that was a big consideration.
Mhm.
Well, look at it the other way, of course, I jumped on the more feminist view of it, but,
Yeah.
but you also look at it that she was apparently thought so well of that two men were willing to go make a long trip,
That's
or
true.
whatever the trip was to go get Peter. That they said,
and
that they were
I-
willing to do that, or thought that that was
Laura
the
was
right
going to
thing
say
do.
something.
I was going to say just that the women were staying with Dorcas. They would be taking care of the body. They would be bathing her and
Mhm.
cleaning her. You would not have men doing that at that time.
Yeah.
So the women were probably not available to travel.
But I think it was also not as safe for women to travel alone. Yeah.
Norma, did you want to say something?
I was thinking like Laura was that, men were kind of useless at that stage of it. So you might as well send them down the road.
We are
Use of your
bad. We are
resources.
bad.
Thanks a lot.
No, we all have our gifts and our time to use them. So,
And to go back to the expectations of women and the fact that women had to have jobs that could be interrupted.
yes.
Sending two women to travel, what about their children? What about, I think that it would be a very difficult thing to do. I think that when I read the stuff by Brown about, you have to be able to, even in ancient times, women were juggling more things and possibly still carrying the mental load.
We are the original multitaskers.
Yeah, you'll find that out tomorrow.
So yeah, there are a lot of reasons not to send the women.
Yes.
It's funny that brings to mind an image. I recall just the other day when I was sewing as my job after my second child was born. So he was about 15 months old. He would sit on my foot while I was pressing the presser foot of the sewing machine. And you just learn to get on with it while you watch the kids.
Yep.
So it's very real
Multitask.
to me.
Well, all this discussion has been kind of interesting because you're right. You have to take these things in the historical context. And I forgot that for a moment because sometimes it's so jarring to see how male dominated the society was at that time. And you read these things, you say, gee, they had to send the guys to go get Peter. But it also harkens back to what you said in your Bible study about women in the ministry. And it reminded me of a woman I knew at college. She was an older woman at the church who wanted desperately to be a pastor, but it wasn't open to her. And so she did everything she could besides that, and was a great spiritual leader. And then several years later, she did become a pastor when they allowed women to become ordained. So I guess that's kind of, why I sort of think of that, because I was around when that transition happened. And we started
Me
having
too.
the women ministers. Yeah.
Yeah, one of our instructors, Dr. Shore in the SAMS program told us that if she had not been allowed to be a pastor, she would have found a way to share the gospel. And I figure most women did it that way. They found a way.
Yeah.
And she wasn't the pastor's wife, she's a professor's wife.
Uh-huh.
I went to a former Lutheran college and was still had a lot of Lutheran atmosphere to it, even though it's private.
And we got, we did get a little off topic.
Sorry.
It's okay. I'm thrilled. But is there any questions or anything else anybody wants to talk about? The weaving, the spinning, whatever.
I wanted to just share a memory that of my great grandmother. Her church would make pillowcases and aprons and sell them to support the church. And they did a lot of like mission things like that. And she didn't have a lot of money, but she could make those. And that's a precious memory.
Yes, yes, yes. And the fellowship that occurs as you sit around and do that together.
Mhm.
Oh my. Cooking and sewing.
And this is on topic. I'm not going to go off on a big tangent again.
You got to start
My grandmother sewed all her life. She was a wonderful seamstress. And she sewed clothes for my sister and I, all the time. And for herself. And I think we've always said what her effect was on other people. But she got a tremendous amount of satisfaction and like pouring her love into the clothes she made. She made us a new dress every Christmas. There was a Christmas dress and the Easter dress.
Oh,
And that was
wow.
part of our gift at Christmas, our Christmas dress. And we helped pick out the fabric and we had the fittings, of course, we knew what it was. But she was always, that was a big thing and she'd made it with love. And I think that was an important part of what she wanted to do. And I think we maybe need to give Dorcas, acknowledge that Dorcas probably made it with love too. And that was an important part of what she felt in doing this, that it was emotional, not just a service, but an emotional service.
Right.
Jessica, did you want to say something?
Yeah, it just had to do with, well, it has to do with Dorcas, of course, but Phyllis was asked last night, why was she a saint? And of course, for Dorcas, the miracle is clearly in the part of the story. So we know why she becomes a saint. And she is the saint of, go figure, tailors and weavers.
Oh.
But the interesting thing was, because we were speaking about misconceptions, when I was looking it up, a lot of the websites refer to her as the widow, let's see, maybe I can even pull it up. Saint Tabitha the widow. But there is nothing actually in our Bible text that says she is married or not. Yep. So there are some maybe perhaps misconceptions, but some leaps that people have made that aren't actually in the text. And it's probably happened to every single one of these women that we are studying.
Sort of like Mary riding on that donkey.
I did go back and someone sent me a link to tell me how Lydia became a saint, and it was way, in the last few hundred years, and I think it was through the Greek church, and I don't know their process. So anyway, that makes sense because there are those icons of her.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. You'll have to look it up because I didn't memorize that for my presentation, but her Catholic saint day is October 25th. I don't know why that one stuck, but her Lutheran saint day is either the 27th of this month or somewhere at toward the end of this month. So if you want to celebrate your weavers and remember Dorcas, look that up because it's this month.
Glad to hear they didn't give her the 29th.
Yeah, let me just say that, Jessica, and the reason why we chose these three is that their saint day is January 26th,
There you go.
which would
Oh.
be around the time that we are doing Power in the Spirit, and that's why we chose those three to
Oh, wow.
this year.
Wow.
Thank you all. We're gonna move back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.